The story I'm going to tell today was very unsettling to research because of the nature of the crime involved. But it brought home to me the utterly unbelievable depths of cruelty that some humans can sink to for personal gain. But it also caused me to question, why would one of the men involved, who came from a respectable background and had a promising future career as a TV investigative journalist, throw it all away by sinking to those same depths? It was a quiet June morning in 2003 when a place called Burnt House Farm, nestled in the picturesque Cheshire countryside, would become the scene of a brutal and calculated murder. For Brian Waters, a husband and father of two, who had a dangerous secret, that morning would end in unspeakable tragedy, leaving a trail of questions, revelations, and a quest for justice that would go on for almost a decade. On the face of things, Brian Waters seemed like a normal man, balancing family life with his wife Julie and his two children, Gavin and Natalie. But he had a dangerous secret. Behind this veneer of normality, he was doing something extremely illegal. Brian had become involved in the drugs trade, specifically cannabis, which at the time was a Class B drug. Possession of it, and definitely the trafficking of it, could get people in a lot of trouble. Why was Brian involved in this, you might ask? Well, he had some financial struggles, but it was also the promise of easy money from the trade. But being involved in the drug trade comes with a price, and it brought him into contact with some very unsavoury people. One of these was a man called John Wilson, who was known locally for being brutal and ruthless. John Wilson was feared in the locality. He was renowned for his harsh methods of enforcing loyalty and recovering debts from people who owed him money. Wilson had built a small empire of fear, and he had one rule: nobody, but nobody, cheated him. 4 years earlier, Brian had been stopped by customs officers whilst returning into the country at Dover. When he was searched, he was found to have £23,000 cash in his suitcase. Customs officers did not know where this money had come from, but they suspected some wrongdoing. And because Brian couldn't explain, or rather wouldn't explain, where the money had originated, it was confiscated. But eventually Brian was released without charge. However, he found himself in a world of trouble, and this is where his world started to unravel. The money he was carrying belonged to John Wilson, and indeed was the proceeds of drug trafficking. Now, up until this point, Brian had also been growing cannabis on a limited basis, but because of his debt, he rented Burnt House Farm and started to increase his growing operation, utilising the large barn that the farm had. But he kept this a secret from John Wilson because he feared that, for one reason or another, Wilson would either just take all the money willy-nilly from the cannabis that Brian was growing, or he might indeed usurp and take over the operation himself. If Wilson did that, it would leave Brian with no means of paying back the debt, which amounted to some £20,000. Now, Brian had assured Wilson that he would pay back the debt. But Wilson was an impatient man, and he made it clear to Brian that he wasn't going to wait forever. He wanted his money. He also made it clear that if the money was not paid back, there would be severe repercussions. In the 1990s, as I mentioned, cannabis was a Class B drug, and you could get into a lot of trouble with it. But around about 2003, there were moves to downgrade cannabis from a Class B drug to a Class C drug. This meant that people thought they couldn't get into as much trouble either possessing it or selling it, and so demand went up. Brian saw this as an opportunity to earn more money. With the farm, his growing business expanded, and there was potential with the amount of cannabis he was growing to bring in around £3,000 a month. Brian was at the time running the operation with his lifelong friend Mujahid. But with the amount of cannabis he was growing, as the business expanded, he found himself in need of more help, and he needed people that he could trust. So after discussions with his partner, Mujahid, they brought in Mujahid's stepson, Suleiman, and they also made Brian's children, Gavin and Natalie, aware of what was going on, because they also needed to enlist their help. So as you can see, the number of people getting embroiled in this terrible, dangerous operation increased. Now, Brian was not only growing cannabis, he also worked part-time as a market trader, trying to both support his family and repay the debt to Wilson. But Wilson was a very impatient man, and after a while his patience ran out. Wilson decided that it was time to pay Brian a visit and enforce the debt that he owed. It wasn't just about the money, it was about sending a message and proving a point. This message was to go out to anyone who thought that they could cross Wilson, and unfortunately for Brian, Wilson had decided that as part of sending that message, Brian had to pay with his life. Wilson came up with a plan to teach Brian a lesson, and for this he enlisted a team of what he called enforcers. The first of these was a man called James Raven, who was known for his brutality, a history of violence, and his loyalty to Wilson. As Wilson's main enforcer, Raven was known for his willingness to do anything to maintain Wilson's power. The next person involved was Otis Matthews. He was the youngest of the group. Now, his involvement revealed the reach of Wilson's influence. But perhaps the most intriguing figure in the group of enforcers was Christopher Guest Moore Jr. Now, this last person was the person that I mentioned in the introduction. He seemed completely out of place in the world of crime, especially as an enforcer. I told you he came from a well-to-do family and he had a promising career. Moore Jr. worked as an investigative TV journalist, and he had once worked as an undercover TV researcher with a well-known investigator, Donald McIntyre. This work was to expose criminal activity. I have a question in my own mind. Why would a guy in his situation get involved with such things, throwing away a valuable career? But it would seem that he had a different side to him. He seemed drawn to danger, and whether it was greed or a thrill-seeking personality, or indeed some form of twisted loyalty to Wilson, he got involved with Wilson's plan. A plan that would lead to one of the most horrific crimes in recent memory. Now, as June 2003 came about, Brian went on one particular day to the farm as usual. But on this occasion, because of Wilson's suspicions that something was not quite right, two men were following Brian. He didn't know this at all, but they were there. These men were two of Wilson's henchmen. Eventually, details of what was going on at the farm came to Wilson's attention, and he dispatched 4 men. These men were James Raven, Otis Matthews, Christopher Moore Jr., and David Moran. And when they arrived at the farm, no one was there, so they ransacked it, and they got a van and took lots of the cannabis that was growing, and they also took a lot of the growing equipment. Shortly after this, Suleiman, who, as I said before, had been enlisted to help with the cannabis operation, arrived, and he was surprised to see the door of the barn open. That was unusual. It was usually securely locked. But there were more surprises, sadly, in store for Suleiman. As he entered, he was attacked by the 4 men. The men dragged Suleiman to the cowshed, and they dragged him around and beat him severely. The men threatened to drown him and then poured chemicals on his head. At the time, his head was covered with a pillowcase, but the chemicals still affected him drastically. And one of his torturers was heard to say, and I quote, "This stuff is wicked." In addition to this, Suleiman was set on fire, and his torturers also used an industrial-strength staple gun to staple his t-shirt to his body. Can you imagine what this man was going through? But while they were torturing Suleiman, the men heard a car pull up outside. They had no idea who it was, but they heard a car door slam, and they went out to see who had arrived. It was Brian Waters, who had no idea that the men were also lying in wait for him. The four men rushed out and grabbed Brian, and after a struggle, they dragged him, bloodied and dirty, into the barn. By this stage, after a slight beating outside, Brian was already injured. But it was nothing compared with what was to come. At this point, they put a rope around Brian's feet and threw it over a rafter. They hauled him up and held him over a barrel. Now, this was something that Suleiman had also already endured. So having tied Brian upside down, the men went on to beat him with pipes and canes. He was dunked into the barrel of water. The men threatened to drown him. And after some of this treatment, he was let down and dragged to a chair. All the while, his captors kept on saying to him, "Where's the money? Where's the money?" As part of the torture, someone set a plastic bag alight and started dripping the molten plastic onto Brian. Again, they chanted, "Where's the money?" They also started on Brian with the industrial stapler as well, and he ended up with staples in his chest, his head and his abdomen. But possibly one of the most chilling and unsettling aspects of the torture was that they inserted a metal pipe into Brian's body. I'm not going to give you the graphic details, but we'll say that this was a sexual assault. And the assault was so brutal, and the metal pipe was rammed into his body so far that it ruptured him internally. Brian's torture went on for some 3 hours, but then things got even worse. Gavin and Natalie arrived at the farm, thinking they were just helping with a normal day's cannabis growing. But men who were wearing balaclavas rushed out and dragged them into the cowshed. This was done at gunpoint, and as they went in, they saw their bloodied and bruised father. And it's at that point, I can only imagine, they were completely horrified at what they were seeing. The men had a gun, and they threatened Gavin and Natalie, pushing Natalie into a corner. Gavin was also assaulted, and as part of the assault, he had his nose broken. But both Gavin and Natalie were forced to see the last moments of their father's life. Not only had Brian been brutalized with the metal pipe, he was covered in bruises and cuts, burns from the molten plastic that had been dropped upon him. He'd also had acid thrown on him, and as I mentioned before, he had staple gun staples in his head, his chest, his arms and his abdomen. It was later found that as part of his beating, he had a punctured lung which had collapsed. Now, as Gavin and Natalie looked on, they saw the punishment continue on their father, and regrettably, they saw their father take his last breath. Once Brian had died, the men dragged him out of the shed and into a nearby milking shed where they left his body. After this, Gavin was forced to make a telephone call to his mother, Julie, and the torturers forced him to tell her that some of his friends were coming over to pick up something. And it was at this point that Otis and Christopher were dispatched to fetch Julie and bring her back. This Otis and Christopher did, and when they arrived at the house, they grabbed Julie and forced her into the boot of a car and took her back to the farm. But just prior to putting her in the boot of the car, they had dragged Julie around the house saying, "Where's the money? Where's the money?" But of course, Julie didn't know the exact details of what they were talking about. Now at the time, Otis and Christopher were dispatched to fetch Julie. David Moran, it would seem later, on Wilson's instructions, made an anonymous phone call to police. It is unclear why he asked him to do this. He stated that he was a passer-by at the farm and that he'd seen someone being attacked by two men. When the police tried to press him to get further details, he said, I didn't want to get involved. And the police said, OK, we'll send some people to check it out. Now, after a short while, police cars started to arrive at the scene of the crime. And the torturers, the other men that were left in the barn, heard the sirens coming, and because they thought, well, there's not many buildings around here that could attract police, they're probably coming here. We'd better get out, and they fled. When police arrived, they were absolutely shocked at the level of violence that had gone on at the scene. It's reported that Suleiman was rushed to hospital with terrible injuries. But of course, for Brian, it was too late. He died right in front of the eyes of his own children. As details of what had happened were uncovered by police, Wilson, Raven and Matthews were pretty soon arrested. But it seems Christopher Moore Jr. was nowhere to be found. He'd vanished, and it would later become clear that he'd fled from the UK. David Moran, however, was also arrested. After investigations, Wilson, Raven and Matthews were all charged with murder. Eventually, they would go on trial and be convicted, and they would all be handed life sentences. David Moran was also charged with murder, but he cooperated with police. He gave them information about Wilson, and because of his cooperation, he received a much lesser sentence. And when I say lesser, I mean 21 months. Is that too lenient for a man who was clearly involved in such a brutal murder? Christopher Moore Jr. was, however, a different kettle of fish. As I mentioned, he'd fled the UK, and this would trigger one of the biggest manhunts ever. At that point, he became one of Europe's most wanted men, and a European arrest warrant was issued for him. The reason that Christopher Moore became the subject of such a search, even though he wasn't found at the crime scene, became clear afterwards. In a fairly horrible discovery, whilst they were searching the shed where the torture took place, police found a bag of human waste, we'll call it, in a carrier bag. In this, allegedly, there were also pieces of a torn-up pram cover that had been used instead of toilet paper. They also found cigarette butts, and these connected Christopher Moore with the crime, and this is why he became one of Europe's most wanted men. It would later become apparent that Christopher Moore's parents had helped him escape, and that Moore was using his wealthy connections in parts of Africa and Europe to stay beyond the reach of justice. He in fact travelled across Europe and parts of Africa, using his money to live a luxury lifestyle, despite having been complicit in a terrible crime, and all the while his other people that committed the crime languished in jail. And for a period of 16 years, sightings of Christopher Moore popped up all over Europe and parts of Africa, but every time that police followed up on the tip-offs, he had gone. And it wasn't until 2019, after one more tip-off, he was finally found in Malta. He was in fact living under another name of Adam Lamb, and as I said, living a luxury lifestyle, in fact as a yacht captain. He was brought back to the UK, and in December 2021 he stood trial for the murder of Brian Waters. During the trial, prosecutors revealed the extent of his active participation in the torture and murder of Waters. Despite the facade of a well-to-do young man with a promising future, the prosecutors painted a picture of a man who was as calculating as he was cruel. The jury eventually found him guilty, and he was sentenced to life imprisonment, with the judge recommending a minimum tariff of 24 years. For the Waters family, it was a bittersweet ending to the trauma, and nothing could undo what had gone on with the loss of a father and a husband under such brutal conditions. But it was also a powerful reminder that justice, no matter how long it was delayed, could always be served. The story of Brian Walters' murder is one of betrayal and brutality, but it's also one of perseverance. It's a case that reminds us of the devastating consequences of greed and violence, but it also reminds us of the resilience of those who fight for justice, even in the face of tragedy. As I reflect upon this harrowing tale, again, I'm left with the question that I started off with, at least one of the questions. How can normal human beings sink into the depths of such devastating cruelty? Perhaps the answers don't lie just in their actions, but also in the shadows of their pasts. And I guess it's a chilling reminder that even in the quietest places, the darkest things can still lurk. Of course, our condolences go out to the families of the victims involved. And on that note, I'll ask you to stay curious and stay safe. And thank you for watching.